Hello everyone, today we talk about the end of the Western Roman Empire. Believe it or not, we never made a video specifically dedicated to it. Today I would like to keep it very simple, right? This can be just an outline or maybe an introduction, but it's too few to be an introduction, but it's just to realize what we're talking about in the first place. A very small sketch of the sequence of events that led to it, generally speaking, and trying to understand more broadly what's the significance of it, right? For us, of course, but mostly for the people that lived at the time, right? And today I would like to set the ground in this base, right? There are normally two extremes around which revolve the major historical interpretations of this story. From one side, the fact that it was a tragedy, it was a traumatic process, that lots of things changed for the worse. From the other side, the fact that basically nobody realized it happened, that, it was just a gradual transformation, it was kind of a soft process. Well, I think the truth here lays in the middle, right? You can't take these extremes and saying, it was, well, fundamentally all bad or all good. It was definitely an important moment, a tough one, but also one in which there was a gradual and positive development at the same time, and human societies are capable of this. Just the other day we were discussing, for example, the Visigothic religious policy in 5th century Aquitaines, or we are more or less here, just on a more provincial scale, in that video, and we will see how objectively, yes, you and this is the beauty, in my opinion, of this period, and how it amazes you, how it really changes your mind in many ways, that fundamentally, yes, it was a pretty troubled moment. It was a moment of great fear, of instability, of crisis, indeed, of decline as well, of much wars, of destructions, of kills, right, of plague. But it was at the same time, because of this very reason, as in every time of crisis, a moment that took, out kind of the best from the protagonists that led the cultures that were protagonists of these events, which doesn't mean that there weren't mistakes, which doesn't mean in fact it was all there were many wrongdoings, and as always, right, many problems that, if fixed, might have made the whole thing progress in many ways a lot better, right, independently from their direction. But this period in history is significant exactly because it kind of managed to bring together certain elements that in later times have been conceived historiographically and are still, seen in such perspectives sometimes, at least in popular culture, to a positive orientation. I mean, of common purpose and cooperation, right? The western half of the Roman Empire fell. But what did really happen? What is it so bad? What did really happen after? It wasn't that bad, objectively, right? Things got worse at some points because of other factors that are not directly linked, seemingly, to the fact that this political and institutional body had vanished substantially. Because that's also how it happened, right? It wasn't really a crumbling. It took a while before the fall of the West was achieved, and especially, and that's what makes you perhaps get the better sense of the dimension of the phenomenon, is that it didn't quite pass through the disruptive end of something, but it was simply the sort of the evaporation of an authority, a power that was basically seized just by others in other places, right? Here the geographical dimension is also particularly important. Most of the wars happened for different reasons, and also concentrated in certain specific areas, right? That's what we always say, for example, that whatever happened, for example, in Britain, during or even before, telling the Anglo-Saxon migration, was something that definitely we're taking a look at very seriously, because it seems that has really disrupted much of politics and society up there. not because of any particular wrongdoing in the sense of, it went worse because there was an invasion or there was a specific war, but simply because there was a re-equilibration of certain, for example, ratios in land distribution, property assets. In other countries, take Italy, for example, well, the worst thing that actually happened to Italy was the reincorporation of it in the Roman Empire, right? As long as the Goths ruled Italy, actually, well, they fared much better than the last 30 years of the emperors of Ravenna, right? You take other countries like Spain or Gaul, where you see that instead there's a much greater continuity throughout all the period, right? What really messes up the system in general, is really the Justinian pandemics that seemingly has really stressed out pretty much the system at the point it began to shrink and to transform really at that point to the root in some ways, especially where the Roman presence had been less consistent historically speaking, but there was in fact less continuity with the Roman Empire proper. You take even Africa when it was lost to the Vandals, it wasn't after all such a big deal for the Africans themselves. I mean, the Vandal government has been reevaluated quite much, seeing that objectively didn't have much of a disruptive effect on the world. Then there were seriously bad things happening at the same time during the same migrations of these peoples. I mean, the Vandals hadn't been so nice, for example, when they were in Spain, nor the Visigoths were than when they were in Greece and in certain parts of Italy. The Romans had committed a considerable amount of their resources to actually fight each other rather than external threats. Then in this sense we have to realize how external they were perceived at one point. I mean, if you look at the Battle of Adrianople, everybody says, oh yeah, that's the beginning of the end. But if you look at the fact that, 10 years later, the Roman army was able to meet a much dreadful foe that is another Roman army. And the same imperial system was able to put up this resource. So you realize you can't identify in that single factor, for example, the cause of the disruption of the empire. The Visigoths could be renowningly be wiped out at least on 2 occasions, if not 3, by Stilicho, and the Romans decided not to do it because they needed the Visigoths as political and military pawns to use as they had been before, right? So, as we know, there were quite successful process of integration. The myth of the barbarization of the Roman army is completely wrong. Like, if anything, it was the other way around. It was the barbarians who were Romanized in the Roman army. The Roman army was the most powerful and effective Romanizer of all, and in fact it was also the most efficient element of the Roman state. If the great migrations had not happened, would the western half of the Roman Empire survive? Of course, right? There are pretty consistent chances that would happen. Why not, right? As I often stress when I touch this topic, actually the Western Roman Empire didn't have to fall. There's this other deterministic myth that the Western Roman Empire was doomed. There's no evidence of this whatsoever. Until the very last decades, the Western Roman Empire was able to mount large provincial scale reconquests of certain provinces. There were certain defining moments that helped this passage, but definitely not the fall of the giving back of the imperial insignia in 476 was actually one of those. The same idea of the empire, in this sense, should be framed better in what it was conceived as. That is, a political and military dominion over certain areas, and this was just a nominal factor. Of course, it was perceived, as we will see now, also as the end of something, right? It is not true that in 476 nobody actually understood what happened. The large majority of the population surely didn't give a damn because it literally didn't change absolutely anything in their lives. But when you look at the elites, they definitely understood what was happening. They weren't happy about it. But as we were saying before, in fact, just the Great Migrations, were they alone a decisive factor? Well, no, because we know that the empire itself was already not doing particularly well. Not because there was maybe necessarily once again a decline that could not be stopped for some obscure force, right? But simply because political entities at that time had normally a lot of problems, and when things went worse from political, but also environmental, economical demographic point of view, mix of a lot of factors as always in this great complex systems. Certain elements that push in the other direction usually doesn't fit. We made a lot of videos actually talking about the relation between the Romans, the Germanic peoples, and the Huns, for example. We've seen in there what the big differences that actually existed between the same barbarians, right? The Huns were a very different thing from the Germans. The Germans were intensely Romanized by this point. They had lived at the outskirts of the empire, if not within under the imperium conceptually at certain levels, right? The fact that the Romans didn't occupy stably Germany doesn't actually mean anything on what the empire was actually about. The Germans actually understood which were the advantages of Roman civilization and simply wanted to share them. And they were not particularly good at it, maybe in some ways, but at the same time they showed that they had pretty consistent cultural resources on their own. They dealt pretty well with the subdued populations. Attila was something else, right? The Huns were culturally really something very different from the empire. They could have never been integrated within it as such. But also the myth that the Huns wanted to destroy the Roman Empire has no foundation, historiographically speaking. Attila wanted the Roman Empire to remain actually pretty healthy, at the point he could crop it, like it could milk it like a cow, right? And yet we've seen how even this terrible Hunnic Empire ended. It was definitely a force to be reckoned with, but it also had certain characteristics that didn't favor particularly its stability. Also, it's pretty ridiculous to attribute to any religious policy at this point a general cause of the decline of the empire. That's really nonsensical, especially Christianity helped stabilize greatly the Roman imperial administration, the creation of a common purpose, of a more cooperative world from a social point of view, but also economical point of view. There was definitely the overlapment of the secular state with the religious community that, after all, had been like that also in previous times. It's just that under Christianity, this actually had to do with a different form of administration in the same church that helped to channel also resources towards certain directions. Even in here, you can't say it was univocally necessarily a positive or a negative thing, but you have to give its due to the process, even as a need to stabilize under a common belief, a common allegiance, right? That what was the empire had already going towards since centuries. Like, it's not that the Christians arrived actually wiping out the ancient Roman religion. Nobody at the time of the affirmation of Christianity actually even understood anymore what Roman religion was, right? Even at the time of Cicero, the religious tradition was the one it was, but basically they couldn't decipher it anymore. There was something very different. Even the Roman religion at the time of Cicero was something. The one at the time of Hadrian was something else, right? At the time of Aurelianus, it was something else once again. And these things change, and you can't see even in there it just happens, this terrible factor that intervenes and messes things up. That means not knowing effectively anything about history of religions. Another aspect of this world is definitely the environmental one as well. What did really happen in this system, right? Was there a major climatic Coldening, for example, for major in terms of what can really make a difference for a pre-industrial society, for the crop rates, etc. These are real things. We do know. We have some evidence of these changes that could really potentially disruptive, or even helping growing. There is some consensus regarding this. We were not going to debate it. I largely, I am agree. I'm positive with this, but I also don't think we actually know 100% whether this is really true. I mean, if you really look at the instruments through which this and the methods through which these things are studied and affirmed, you realize that if rather than confirming something, they arise many more questions and problems of interpretation that shows you how actually complex and complicated such societies was. I mean, the Roman Empire was really a giant here. Right, Ed? We don't think at it as a sort of weak organism that had to slow down by the foe. No, this is not. Be very, very careful to trace evolutionary comparisons with political and social entities, because they really do not work like in biology. Right? Something obviously we know is going to end quite likely, but this doesn't mean anything. The Roman Empire lived for another millennium, so you can't say that was doomed, like this interpretation of the long decline of the empire. Well, if there is a decline that lasts like 1,000 years, right, that's probably not really a decline, I would say. But we talked about Byzantine history in general. Another thing, when I say Byzantine here, don't be upset about it. I know perfectly what it means. I just use it not to say, I don't know, the medieval part of the Roman Empire. I hate to say the Eastern Roman Empire, because objectively, especially after 476, there wasn't anything like an Eastern and Western Roman Empire anymore. It was just the Roman Empire, as it had always been, right? Because here the Roman Empire was split in two, but it was just administratively so. The empire was obviously only one. There's never been like two different empires. This is another easy misconception. That's another reason why I don't like to call the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, especially when there wasn't a Western part anymore in the case of the Eastern, because it doesn't make any sense, right? And that's not how they would have conceived it at the time. There is naturally another dimension here that is what was outside the empire, right? So all these other populations, not just in Europe or in Asia, but in Africa, and even interacting at great distance with the empire in itself, and really having a role in influencing many aspects that sometimes we do overlook, right? There is this consistent Sasanian threat on the eastern frontier that was causing ever more problems, and that the Romans actually showed to prove to be able to cope with it pretty well in many ways. The same Germanic peoples, as we have seen, or what we call as Germanic, we made videos also to explain that difference. What is Germanic at this point? It's not very clear. Actually, it's more like the Romans that conceived those peoples as such, but that conscience was spreading just incidentally. In fact, after the Roman Empire fell and those peoples had settled in those lands where such historiographies had portrayed them as Germanic. There is, think about the domino effect of the Huns as such as the most evident factor that really changed a big deal in the migration era in the Roman imperial history. Objectively, without the Huns, it's quite likely that the Germanic populations would have been absorbed progressively and successfully by the empire, as this had done since centuries. I mean, it's not that the Germans began to be settled as federati just after, in the 5th century, at the end of the 4th century, right? This had gone on ever since the Romans had settled in Gaul, right? It was the regular business for the empire, and that had actually enriched it because it needed demographic resources and labor force, and that's what, especially in times of crisis of trade and of fact of demographic shortage, that is what boosted the same Roman economy. Great deal of the same Roman imperial policy and propaganda at this very moment of the late Roman history up to the fall of the West was centered on the success of the Romanization of the barbarians, right? That was really what the Romans aimed at, because they thought they had this divine mandate to make everybody a Roman, to have it civilized, and to stabilize this universal order that they embodied as the chosen by the great deity. And that's also what this religious dimension of this era has really to be studied better, in my opinion, because it contains the key to understand really a lot of what it meant to be within the empire, to exercise an empire at this point. And we would be very surprised to see how actually the same barbarians believed in the empire as such, right? They didn't maybe believe that it was just a Roman prerogative, which is what the Romans basically saw it like by tradition and by that point. But the system of beliefs at this point was strikingly more homogeneous than we think, right? And that's also what favored the progressive extension of a unifying religion at one point that remained permeated with paganism for centuries and centuries, without that even the same ecclesiastical elites really cared anything about, because that wasn't a problem at all. Paganism in itself hadn't any instrument to be competitive with Christianity, could even remain there in part. The main problems coming instead from Christianity itself, from the heresies, the so-called heresies, at least from the Nicene Orthodox, that troubled the empire, and chiefly the Near Eastern regions, North African regions as well, and that in the West were mostly felt because of the difference in creed between the Catholics and the Arians that we have discussed also at length on Schwerpunkt. So if you're interested just in looking at these things, there is a migration era playlist that I think many of you already know, but there is a medieval Christianity playlist, Roman history playlist, and in general you can find all of this stuff pretty easily there. Just type this on YouTube or Google, Schwerpunkt, Arians, relative Christianization, well, this thing, you'll find it pretty easily. So starting to talk about this phase, well, we can start by looking at the territorial dominion of Rome and how it was fundamentally changing. Not much at a geographical level, really, but in the intensity of its effectiveness. Especially, at this point, after Theodosius was the last Roman emperor that actually ruled over a unified empire, in the sense that, aside from after 476, the empire comes to be back all one, administratively speaking. Theodosius had defeated many enemies, especially also internal, and had managed to curb this usurpers and to reunite all the European and Mediterranean dominions of Rome. We made a video specifically on this, on why also Theodosius finally basically shifted the center of the empire in the east, which was not so obvious, right? Since the 3rd century, definitely it had appeared evident that there were certain key cities that weren't not Rome anymore. We're talking chiefly about Trier, Milan, Serdica, and Nicomedia, right? Then Constantine arrives and he refounds Byzantium and names it Constantinople, but not even in there, even with another senate created on the Bosphorus, actually Rome lost its importance or centrality. Rome, throughout all of this time, literally throughout all of this time, remains the capital of the empire, and actually throughout all, even what we call Byzantine history, this is what remains the goal of the empire. A Roman emperor has one duty, first of all, is to reconquer Rome at all costs. Rome is always the capital of the empire, never ceases to be. It has an enormous divine significance, both from a pagan and Christian perspective at this point, and the The idea, though, is that there is an increase on the reliance of imperial administration on the eastern part of the empire, which is on average richer. It's closer to the great intercontinental trade routes with China that pass through it and arrive at it. Actually, it has a pretty good position in terms of reaching areas, for example, quite fertile of grain, like the Pontic area, that will become very important, especially after the Islamic invasions, where Egypt was lost. But that was important strategically also because of all these movements of peoples that were threatened to swarm into the imperial border. So that being there was meant to be closer to the threat. This is also why the Theodosian walls were built. This fortification that lasted basically, well, yes, it was overwhelmed at one point, I think about 1204, but basically it remained useful till 1453, the very end of the empire. It was this region that is fundamentally southern Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, and Syrian, Palestinian, Lebanese, and Egyptian coasts, and Cyrenaean coast, were lands of ancient civilization, of solid urbanization. They were fertile, right? They had pretty good maritime interconnection, so they were easy. They were the core territories of the empire. What we have to consider in this regard, an interesting view of looking at why the West was also kind of more exposed to invasions, and it kind of was more difficult to control, is that objectively the West controls a much greater space of land, territorially speaking, because it includes many more continental European territories, right? Whereas the real core of the empire in the east is towards the coasts, that in this sense are even more compacted and easier to defend. Instead, great chunks like, I don't know, Gaul or Spain, or especially from Italy, are that this still at this point basically the center of the empire. In spite of its decline, its goal was actually a bigger chunk, but still Italy also played its part, and it had its own advantages as well. It was also closer to the main grain supplies of Africa, today's Roman Africa, today's Tunisia. So these factors are important. So in fact, the binomium Italy and Africa is similar in this kind of logistical sense towards what was happening in the Eastern Mediterranean because of communications and supplying systems, etc. There are other factors that have to be considered here. There were many regions that were going depopulated, especially in fact on the external side of this world, and even largely sometimes within these large surfaces, extensions of the Western Roman Empire. In the same Balkans, actually, in the eastern half, there is a gradual recession, you can say, of Romanization. There are other peoples that are also being settled there, the Goths being the most famous, but were other groups coming from literally everywhere and part changing. At the end of the day, the Slavs arrived. they literally overwhelm everything. They saturate everything. They arrive up down to the Peloponnese, but that kind of happened a bit later. Sometimes they even crossed Mediterranean, went to Africa. And we don't have to underestimate in this regard human mobility, because at this point, yeah, there is a territorial domination, but there are no real borders as we intend them, especially, if there had ever been military boundaries, like actual militarized frontiers, well, these were mostly, at all times, systems of fortifications. There were certain walls, but these were placed just in areas where, they thought they could be more effective against certain types of enemies, and it was mostly just to slow down large armies than actually blocking small bands or even certain population movements that were actually welcomed for the aforementioned reasons. So this is very important to understand. These are also great surfaces, right? And they're difficult to control, and the most effective way to control it is military deterrence. So it's not really a matter of how you actually stay there with troops. There were permanent garrisons in there, especially after the Constantinian reforms with the Ripuari, with the this local border guards were actually border communities at the end of the day. They were simply farmers that were given in there this space to control. But the real bulk there was the permanent army, like the mobile army, actually, the one that the really professional bulk of troops that really worked as a, beware that if you dare step into our territory, we arrive against you, and it's going to be cool for you. And the Roman military machine at this point, telling the truth, was a hell of an effective weapon, especially throughout the 4th century. Was a pretty damn good one. Concerning a sort of decline in the 5th century, well, this is true, but once again, it's not because of the formula was wrong. It was that simply it was a shortage of resources. I mean, the Roman army was the best thing ever out there as long as the state functioned. If the state had enough resources, it could control them, organize the army, everything was fine. The army was the best trained, best equipped, and it definitely, nobody had better standards than that around the empire. And well, this ceases because resources are cut off, supply lines do not work anymore, certain chunks of lands are lost, because you committed yourself. You have to be committed in several theaters. You can't control them all. This is another very important factor. Well, these resources get eroded. Your army lacks resources. You have to rely on other systems. In fact, there is this on the idea of the barbarization of the Roman army. Well, it's actually incorrect because there was something that was properly the Roman army, and then there were other groups that were basically associated to it in different ways that didn't contemplate sometimes even the concept that these people were under Rome from their own point of view, right? And therefore, that's not the Roman army anymore. It's someone else's army, actually, that works on its own, right? It's not the small bands that you can still assimilate in the army, right? The major crisis from that point of view was just after a couple of decades after Adrianople, where there was this mass of Visigoths that were, or simply Goths, telling the truth, they were included in the army, but they never surpassed, I think, one third of the entire numbers. They created some problem in the east, on the Persian frontier, because of discipline and things, but they actually, for the rest, fought pretty well. They also paid a very heavy toll of blood for Rome, on the name of Rome, and they were fine with that. That was their goal, after all, to escape the Huns and to have a new life elsewhere. This thing, however, gets, the system gets overloaded at one point, and that's where we start from. And the western borders of the empire began to be, incapable of stemming the push exercised by the Germanic populations. This began actually on all fronts, but let's say that the western ones were more exposed. It was in this moment that we have the action of the Roman general Stilicho, who also has most of these commanders at this time had a multi-ethnic origin. He was, they were actually all of barbarian ancestry in part, and with the local of Romans of older, belonging to the empire. And they were faithful Romans in this regard. They were very interested, very ambitious for what concerns imperial power itself. They always hoped they could rise to the top and become emperors themselves, right? This was in part a problem of the empire since quite a long time, actually. Was probably the only fault of the Principate. At this point, though, the thing had changed, and since Diocletian and Constantine especially, at least, the empire also pushed towards a more kind of dynasticized monarchy in this regard, so that there was a clear identification, even how succession problems had to be solved in the first place. It was really a complicated game. It was a game of clienteles, as always in the Roman world, but not only. And it gravitated around not just politics, but direct involvement in military affairs, of course, that are the same part of the same thing. But it's undeniable that this state was undergoing, a process of militarization in some form, right? Even Political and social freedom was tightened in general. First of all, there was a crystallization of society. There was an increased certification. There were fewer yet richer people and more and poorer people, and this kind of facilitated the control of large masses that were largely reverting back to the land where they had always belonged, actually, for most of the times. But here we see the decline of cities, even from a demographic point of view. A lot of people that, because of wars or epidemics and simply infrastructural shortages, they were obliged, actually, at one point to go back to work in land. It was way more advantageous, actually, to live as a colonist in a latifundium, which was definitely not an easy life, but still protected by the dominus, by this essentially lord that would become, the typical Romano-Germanic lord at the end of the empire in its essence. Then being out there, and there were not many other options. Even the story of the lack of commitment of the Roman ruling class, this associated to this alleged moral decadence, is actually very, very debatable, if not plainly wrong. Actually, what do you invest? Like, if an activity is not remunerative anymore, why would you invest in it? Right? The Roman ruling class had always basically been working on a redistributionist base. Like these aristocrats got certain official certain offices in the empire that entailed basically to make things work with their own money, so that they could be legitimized to to speculate on this and that specific asset, but still be in charge for making it work. If the city in itself as a strategic asset is declining in power, why would you invest in it? You invest in the countryside, and it's not just because to your benefit, but to the benefit of the state itself, right? So naturally, this doesn't mean that things were getting on average better, right? There were certain regions of the empire that objectively saw reprisal. I mean, Constantinople being the most obvious and therefore can even useless example in this regard of a city that grew, monstrously, and that attracted so many resources and became actually a true capital of a universal empire. In other areas of the empire, the majority actually saw this process of ruralization and of decline of urban centers that we also discussed many occasions, and there were not many other ways to do that, right? It was reasonable to do that, and there was also maybe not an option. And this is also what I think we should learn when we look at at past events and pretending that we can judge them on the basis of a moral, these guys had all it wrong, they would have had to do the exact opposite. What do you think they did that in the first place? Because at one point, some emperor woke up one day and decided to reverse the system. How do you think these things actually work, right? This is very important also historically speaking, because at this time we start having actually also less sources, right? It's the way society works that produces more than less sources in itself, aside from the problem of preservation, but also that do matter, because there are destructions, there are declines, there are also different interests. But the point is, we get a much more sophisticated picture, vision, and narrow, in this sense, vision of that world that tells us a lot of things actually in turn on that world, exactly because of it, but through which we can't really see very, very well, right? If you look at the figure of these emperors, 4th, 5th century, and you try to be objective about these accounts, well, you're not going to make a good job as a historian, because renowningly that historiography, that literature, is bent to certain purposes. We don't know basically anything of how those characters actually were. We don't. It's as if you were to rely just on extremely biased sources on every single figure that also, in this sense, kind of resemble each other, right? Because the cliches and the stereotypes are always kind of the same. But what do we actually know about how that system works and why these people took those decisions? Well, that's a very different thing to do. Not that we can't do it in absolute terms, but we should also be realistic and consistent about what is the face in this regard, and what's behind that. What's the historical reality that often escapes us, as always, too often, but it's unavoidable. So this actually Stilicho was considerable a Vandal general. Seemingly also, I think the origins are debatable, but whatever. We the important thing here is to spot there was a deep allegiance from all the people that gravitated around the empire, that were capable of being integrated into it, to the same empire. You can't say that Stilicho was less Roman than the commanders of 2 centuries before, right? They were truly feeling the point of being part of that system and what they could derive from it. And if they got to those positions, was not, as internal destroyers, but on the contrary, they wanted to strengthen the system so that they could benefit from it again, right? And really, the origin here doesn't matter in any way, specifically here, right? And we should talk once again more about the concept of universalism of the empire. It was not just on paper or ideally, right? It had a true meaning because the empire had effectively worked on that base. It was something too big. It's not a different phase for which these guys get, the empire gets, overwhelmed or basically, destroyed by its own integrative policy. Well, there is not anything of this kind. The problems are very different. And on the contrary, as long as the empire kept absorbing external elements, it kept working on its own. This is debatable in the measure in which definitely something escaped from control, and definitely you always had to control this process, but the point is that as long, once again, that the state worked, the lack of control in this systems to decline of the empire in itself, right? It didn't happen like that. Fine. So Stilicho definitely fought against the Visigoths, right? At this point, consider that was also this fairly strained relation between the eastern part and the western part. The two halves weren't very, they were actually fairly cooperative, but they still pursued different aims. They also carried out different policies, or maybe even where they carried out the same, that that there were different outcomes in the respective contexts. Think about the anti-Germanic reaction, for example. In the East, it functioned, although it was really not much about the end of German presence that was very strong, quite always, and it would keep it to be. Another proof, by the way, that in the Eastern half, this foreign presence continued on and on and on, and this didn't weaken the system in itself. On the contrary, in the Western half, actually the anti-Germanic purges brought to quite serious problems, including the sack of Rome in itself, but not only. The same death of Stilicho, there's maybe not much of an anti-Germanic stance, but a fear that fundamentally this general was too powerful in some ways, but was done at the wrong moment and with no farsightedness. Well, it was a mistake. Right? Stilicho, by the way, was a very, coherent person. He realized there was nothing to do. He died quite honorably, and he was given a soldier's death. And and this was a great problem because he had chased the Visigoths among Italy and, between Italy and the Balkans, and had defeated them on multiple occasions, and yet thought that he basically could use them in some ways, probably even against the central government to take power. Always be aware that, once again, we know certain narratives about the fact that Stilicho was the good guy that got destroyed by the evil emperor, and that it was a great mistake because eventually Rome was sacked. But what actually happened at the time, well, it's difficult to tell on the base of the sources proper, right? We know certain major things happened, you can't trace them, but what were the actual ratios of strength and predictability of certain things? It's really difficult to say, right? But bad choices were definitely taken at the time too, and definitely by the way, Stilicho had fought even against this other barbarian groups at the order of Radagaisus, right? And most of the military operations had taken place in the Po Valley, right? That at that point was becoming actually one of the areas of major strategic significance of the empire, because it basically connected everything, connected Italy with Illyricum, with the Danubian area, with Gaul, with southern, with Provence and with Spain. So it was, since actually a very long time, a very militarized area, and the control of it really meant to have a great power. It was, it would be interesting to analyze every provincial characteristic to understand this better. But consider that in the Po Valley, albeit it wasn't so developed at the time, like, for example, central southern Italy was connected to a Mediterranean dimension, while the Po Valley was more like a central European one. There were actually some of the major cities of the empire, even up to long as having Justinian and Reconquest. If you take cities like Milan, like Verona, or the same Ravenna, I mean, these were major centers that were quite important, would be important for the same Goths and the Longobards, even to establish solid territorial dominations. The Visigoths came to threaten Milan, being eventually defeated and repelled by Stilicho, and as a consequence of this, in 402, the Roman capital was shifted from Milan to Ravenna. That was a city that, being protected from the sea and the swamps from the other side, appeared rightfully so safer than Milan. So here, these are administrative capitals, right? They were already so since the 3rd century, but Rome is still nominally the capital. So let's not make confusion. But it's even in this functionalization of the administrative capitals that was a specific strategic significance to it all in the first place, right? It wasn't just about having the reach trade center, this great area of, Rome had been a largely parasitary city, right? Aside from glass making in imperial time, it was fundamentally absorbing all the resources of the empire, because it was, the empire was safe. Now it wasn't safe anymore, therefore where you want to rule from with your comitatus as an emperor is a city that it may be smaller, but it's more functional, it's more easily defendable, right? So this is the case of such shifts, with the exception maybe of Constantinople, that effectively became much more than that over time, and became a true multifunctional center. And even the horde of Radagaisus that came shortly afterwards would have been obliged to retreat, even though in this case the military victory at Faesulae in 405 would have arrived, even thanks to the support of the troops, largely ethnic German troops that were coming from the Rhineland, the Rhine limes, right? So even in here you see that the Romans managed to crush the army of Radagaisus and fence off another threat, but they needed at this point to make the troops, the Federati largely, from Germany, from Gaul, say better, because at that point, we're still, administratively speaking so, but it had been Germanized. Certain laws of federality had been settled there for the impossibility of even controlling that boundary that had gone depopulated, by the way. This is also another thing should always be believed. It's not that the Germans were faring that better. They had the upper hand on the situation. No, Germans were usually, there were many comprehensively for the empire, but, individually in groups, they were fairly exposed. Like, there were never more than a few tens of thousands of armed men, and needing to be set, and they were settled in areas that were largely depopulated and definitely not the main centers of production in the empire. Certainly not in the most fertile areas of the empire, and that they would cease only when they stopped being federati and they started being, let's say, something else, meaning taking entire chunks, like, I don't know, northern Gaul in the case of the Franks, or with the Visigoths in southern, with Aquitaine and large parts of the Iberian Peninsula, right? That's another phase, but it starts here, right? Because this border on the Rhine was at one point overwhelmed by all these central and Eastern European peoples that basically pushed through. Traditionally, on the 9th of December the 21st, 406, right, that saw the Rhine crossing by this really massive wave of Alans, of Swabians, of Vandals, and of Burgundians that literally, break through, and it's warmed eventually in Gaul and reaching even the Iberian Peninsula. This happened more or less at the height of Mainz. The Franks that were settled actually around that area, a bit more north in Cologne, had as Roman federati, so allies of the empire. This is very meaningful. At once they tried to stop them, and this is very interesting. We made several videos on Frankish history, Frankish history playlist. And you can see in there how initially, the Franks were fine being allies with Rome because they were fairly distant from major centers of Roman power in general, because they were in the far north of Gaul, in areas that once again didn't quite, the Romans were fine at entrusting to the barbarians. And at the border with Germany, so with all these other populations that, at that point were definitely a problem to neighbor, as I said, the Franks were kind of at least more used to them, that they could in a certain sense just continue to live as they had always lived, but with the advantages at least of settling in an area that was more, at least infrastructurally, developed. And the Franks get defeated at this point, right? There is an enormous, in all this story, there is an enormous competition that is also another terribly important topic that is rarely discussed in terms of the internal political debate of the Germans themselves, like of these groups that had always a mixed allegiance, right? There was always among these groups a chunk that was kind of pro-Roman, and another, let's say, pro-Germanic, if you want, that had to make a choice at some point. That is particularly evident for the Franks themselves. But when you think that these troops were actually fighting and dying for Rome, you don't have to think that they were doing it for, because they loved Rome in itself. They probably even barely understood, as majority of the warriors, what that even was. But the elites definitely had seen what the advantages of this all was, and it was they were in part pushing for the anti-traditional side of the story, right? And therefore there was all this inherent tension that also passed through the political certification of these groups that traditionally were kind of egalitarian, let's say, quite, just maybe euphemistically, but at least they definitely wanted to remain without a central. They didn't want a monarchy. That was the real point. But the Romans definitely were pushing for this to happen because they had it easier to control actually just one chieftain that could represent all the others, so that they could be kind of more, they could predict at least more easily how this referent could avoid to deal with every single tribe as they had. Sometimes they were obliged to at the beginning because there weren't greater polities at one point. But the Franks see this major catastrophes, right, and they realize at that point that there isn't much that is preventing themselves from expanding into Gaul, right? And that's the moment in which the Franks, say, well, okay, let's simply also seize our share of land, and therefore they extended it in there. And this, what happened in 406 was in this regard really a big blow, because at that point, just imagine, the problem of Adrianople, of the defeat of the Roman legions in Thrace, and the entrance of an entire people within the Roman boundaries. Well, imagine now there are literally, at least 4 peoples and many other groups that are also very, very difficult to control because they're largely also adventurers and people just wanted to join for loot, right? And it's swarming throughout 2 of the major provinces of the empire, some of the most important, Gaul and Spain, right? So this is really bad, and the Alps as such kind of shield Italy a little bit, but as we've seen, it's not much of a, there's no boundary at that point, it can't be surpassed. The problem is having resources to stop these guys as a deterrent and also physical force in general, to oppose them for when they would have come. Italy had been invaded on many occasions. There had been these raids since the 2nd century AD. It wasn't an easy task even to track the movements of these groups, especially when they were so scattered, right? And that's what the events brought to the death of Stilicho, because he lost the support of the Emperor Honorius, and he was killed after this uprising of the troops that was solicited basically by the anti-Germanic milieu of the court of Ravenna. So because of this, however, there was no valid resistance that could at that point withstand the advance of the Visigoths, who came back at that point, and their point was actually that they had served Rome, which was true, and they wanted to be paid, right? It was always about money, right? These groups were normally, by diplomacy, dealt with money. Actually with gold proper. Like the Germans had gotten kind of clever in this. They wanted just ingots that were minted by the official Rome imperial fabric in this regard, and that therefore represented, an insurance, right, of the value of the precious metal in that volume. They and it also was this stereotype that the Romans said that the barbarians were attracted by shiny things like jewels and gold and other precious stones. It was partly true, also for a technical reason, like these peoples were attracted by the material world of Rome, and they definitely treasured in this sense also the recognition that such diplomatic gifts sometimes represented, even for structuring that internal hierarchy to their own people, meant. So there were very interesting dynamics here that should be taken always in consideration. But diplomacy was done like this since ever, right? And that's what we do today as well. We pay always and constantly lots of people with lots of money just to keep them at bay, and there is really nothing wrong strategically speaking. I mean, if that prevents you from having part of your province is devastated, so that you're going to lose more from the agricultural damage, you're simply paying these guys not to do it, and maybe even tying them to you, because as long as you keep paying them, they kind of start relying on you, and they're kind of allies in this regard. Hence the term federati in Latin, from fedus, this is literally the alliance, or summakoi in Greek, as the more in the eastern part of the empire was taken as the friends, fundamentally. So Alaric came, that was also, by the way, considered that these peoples didn't have quite a monarchical orientation yet, but in this difficult political and military times, they needed to elect a guide, right? That is also a big deal in the history of migration eras, that the Germanic peoples were largely non-stratified before these times, and the migration itself triggers the necessity of having a leader that guides them, and that assumes now certain specific takes on certain specific roles, and that also here there is the idea of the divine mandate and the sacrality of the monarchies, things that are starting to appear in some ways. These figures are very fascinating because they're also very open to the foreign customs. They're often even actually raised as hostages / hosts, let's say, in places like Constantinople. They know Rome pretty well in this regard. This is also happening since ever. Like, even Arminius was grown there. This is really a way to ensure that these populations are at least dealable with. I don't know how to say that, but they also have an interest, because this legitimization can bring them, in fact, power within their own people. And they're also open to Christianity. These peoples are, especially the elites, are becoming all Christian under the Arian Creed, which is their own version, let's say, of Christianity, for which Jesus is really something different from the one of the Nicene Creed. It's more like a human-like figure, like that fitted better with the stereotype of the Germanic hero, that has, in this sense, also kind of a stronger human element in it, whereas in the Nicene Creed it's these two natures that kind of equally present, and which is more digestible also from a strictly religious and cultural point of view for these largely pagan populations, right? It's not that you say, yeah, these guys were Aryans, what does it mean? Well, just the elites were, right? The rest of the population were largely pagans, and don't think that within the empire was that different. Like, yeah, everybody was a Christian nominally. Now Christian equates to Roman by definition, but also because if you're a Roman, you must be mandatory Christian at this point. But the idea is also that you can believe other things fundamentally, that it's not actually a big deal if you still retain, as we were saying before, certain parallel beliefs. And surely in the countryside, where the majority of the population lived, well, the agrarian cults of even of pre-Indo-European dominations were there since millennia, right? So certain things didn't change, and nobody cared, because it effectively didn't bring any major political, social problem at that point, which is what actually religion was mostly concerned of. But Alaric arrives in Italy, and he basically there's a lot of it's complicated because he had made back and forth. He kind of tried multiple times to take Rome. At the end of the day, he manages to enter it, and he sacks for 3 days the city, and especially the richest quarters. The structures are quite limited. They obviously squeezed the city, but they didn't really, behave ferociously. Actually, we have, especially the clergy was highly respected, and this is very, very important, because if you assume that these were, largely pagan from an ethical point of view, still they recognized the enormous importance, prestige, and power of the church that they already had at this point, especially in a city like Rome. And there were also other reasons, surely, that had to do with superstitions, with believe. These peoples believe a lot of that there was especially from a pagan point of view. You don't really need to offend the gods of the place where you go. You have to be fair with them. You have to deal with them in a way that they don't create problem to you. So gratuitous violence was, out of the question. Even though we don't have even to fool ourselves thinking that no crimes were committed. There were, slaughters, robberies, rapes. Right. And this is the normality basically in every situation like this, but Rome gets away with it pretty mildly from a material point of view. Now the problem was enormous, though, from a propagandistic ideological point of view. Right, the Goths basically then abandoned Rome. They marched towards the south, and they wanted to go to Sicily, probably to Africa, so to do something very similar to what the Vandals would have done in reverse from the other direction, let's say, because objectively these were the most fertile areas of the Western Mediterranean, and by occupying them, they could start a kingdom on their own, just like they would do eventually in Gaul and in Spain, and the same Vandals in Africa, in the same in Sicily too. But Alaric died. Famously, he was buried in the river bed of this stream, this river, in southern Italy, and and the rest of the Goths basically came back the way that they came. But they arrived at that point in southern Gaul, where they basically were settled by the same Romans, eventually as federati. Even in here, they were not easy to control. Certain cities opposed their settlement, but at the same time, that they were granted this land. So there was a lot of negotiation for all of this. Just think of all the local communities being very autonomous in the empire. Like, it's not that even the emperors had an actual control on every single thing here. The geographical dimension is important because, especially when you look at these macro chunks like Gaul, Italy, Spain, these were worlds that were already kind of working on their own, right? They had even their own specific identities, their own presumably already substantial linguistical diversification, since even before the Roman conquest, that yes, Latinized Gaul and Spain, but also you could imagine the differences that already existed at that point. Now, as we were saying, it's the symbolic value of the sack of Rome in 410 that really shattered a lot of this myth of the undefeatability of Rome, right? Roma invicta. This was the idea. It could not be defeated because Rome was the center of the empire, and if Rome fell from a military point of view, it meant that the celestial deity of the sky wasn't from her side anymore. It was an enormous deal, right? Rome had not been sacked since the time of Brennus in the beginning of 4th century BC. Yes, of course, there had been during the civil wars, there had been fights, etc., but it was always Romans, right? Even with foreign mercenaries, but still within a Roman civil war. Excuse me, drink a little bit. But therefore, the fall of Rome here was a traumatic event, right? We know it from literature in general. Also, if we look at the highest voices of the Christian world, Girolamos, Augustine, well, they expressed this anxiety and a disconcert for an event that was inconceivable, right? The same Christianity had affirmed itself in the Roman Empire. So God had wanted Christianity to spread in this specific polity, in the heart of Rome, where St. Peter and St. Paul had been martyrized, where the primacy of honor of the Christian Church was held, right? It was the Roman Empire was a Christian empire, so the fall of Rome was really, has God forgotten? Has God forsaken the Romans and the Christians in this regard? I mean, this was a pretty dark, obscure vision, right? It's not that maybe the average peasant in other areas of the Western or the Eastern Roman Empire maybe cared that much objectively, but you have to think of a world that was revolving around the idea of the sacrality of the of politics and its institutions. So this fall equated to something extremely concerning for the future, right? And it was really speechless, a lot of people. The same novelty, same name of it, and you can feel this anxiety, this loss of hope in some ways. On the other hand, the representatives of the pagan intellectualism that still existed, right? Think about the Gallo-Roman Rutilius Damatianus, wrote famously the Redito Sua, that he had been prefect in Rome. He had a very deep respect for the ancient pagan cults and institutions, right? At this point, paganism was still there, as we've seen, in part was still tolerated in the sense that the ambiguity of the belief was accepted, was shared, especially among the Italic aristocracy, the senatorial class, but also the Southern Gallic one, as Damatianus represents, were very, very close to Rome, right? Really, as at a very high level. Well, the idea that the old Roman traditions of pagan, origin were essentially being betrayed by the Christianization was still alive. It was really a perceived feeling, right? It's not that these people necessarily interpreted at the fullest what the old Roman paganism had been. As we were saying before, not even at the time of Caesar, actually, the Romans had a clear perception of what their true original Roman religion had been, because the Romans didn't copy other people's religions. They simply integrated other figures to certain forms, how they were represented, certain myths, etc. But Rome had actually a wholly original religion about which we know almost nothing, right? And this is very famous in the history of religions. The Romans had all their own spirituality, their own beliefs. We have talked about it on some occasion, but we have to deepen that. There are certain beautiful books maybe we can talk about also. But let's say it was a different type of paganism from this. It was a form of elitism, a question of status, like even what was reproached to the Christians in general. That is something that can be observed even sometimes between the Western and the Eastern half of the Roman Empire, was the idea that the Christians were fundamentally ignorant, right? It was not just about the fact of having a very different religious system. We're talking about a monotheism, right? Even the Roman paganism, let's say, had evolved towards kind of an monotheism, and the idea of a central major deity, right? But this had been also true since the early beginnings, but let's say that it had been evolving towards something similar to monotheism over time, right? So this should also be fairly understood. I mean, Julianus Apostate in the 4th century, Julianus, it was called apostate by the Christians, actually, as an apostate of Christ, contempt, derogatory name. But you think, he wanted to impersonate the Roman cult, but those weren't actually Roman cult. They were kind of more Hellenistic, also Eastern kind of cults. It wasn't the ancient true Roman morality, but especially among the Italic senators, there was this legitimate feeling that objectively they were the mostly let's say, Latin-educated elite that were the true depositories of the great Italic cultural legacy, right? That was a mix of several ones. It wasn't just about the Latins and the Italics as such, but also the Etruscans, for example. There were sometimes even certain mystifications about the actual origins, right? It was fashionable, for example, to say that certain families were of Etruscan origin because the Etruscans were very, very aristocratic, very elitary in this sense, and therefore that was very prestigious. But as a matter of fact, these also were built-up models by certain standards. But objectively, the Italic senators were, by any standard, most educated ones in the whole empire. And in fact, it was this bitter criticism that was exacerbated even by, in fact, the decline of, say, Western Roman Empire and the necessity of the Italic senators to rely ever more on Constantinople. The fact that in Constantinople, the senators that had been created there in that parallel government were actually enriched, like they came essentially from the middle class. They weren't the ancient aristocracy that had certain deep values of nobility, of education. They had a pretty good education, but it was also adapted to very pragmatic use within the Byzantine government and its functionality, its meritocracy, etc. So there were two very, very different mindsets, and this exemplifies, in fact, also the distance that was growing in part between the West and the East proper, not much the empire in itself, but the concept that really different parts of Europe had different backgrounds, had different feelings, had different beliefs, right? And in this regard, it's very, very important to study, especially the history of the 6th century and the following centuries in the Mediterranean, as deeply influenced by this need at one point of the Westerners, especially when the empire, the western half was wiped out, to, in a certain sense, to even Germanize more as a response to the Byzantine proper attempt of reintegrating these elements in a system now that was quite different from their own, right? This is a very interesting topic. I should talk more openly in the future about it, because we already addressed it, but it's often overlooked. Like we often deal this process of the migration era from one side were just the Romans, eventually what we call the Byzantines for some reason, and then the Germans, right? As if, the Germans were very few people after all. The lands of the western half of the empire remained inhabited largely by the people who inhabited them before all this had taken place, obviously with a substantial blending with these external elements, but still having a kind of I could say an identity, but also kind of a vision of a culture on their own, right? And this was extremely important. Like, if you don't pass through this stage, you can't fully understand, I think, not just the Middle Ages that came later, but basically up to what we are now today. Right, not just in Europe, but in the world, because the Latin Germanic world objectively created, thanks to this, what we see as a disruption of the Western Empire, something that actually something of enormous importance in terms of civilization, right? And we have stressed it recently, even in that video of the Visigothic kings in Aquitaine, for example, to really the idea of finding a solution, of being open to the idea of negotiating, of confrontating, of creating a positive consensus, which an autocratic model does not produce. And there is a reason. In medieval times, eventually Western Europe took over, basically, in Europe itself and in the Mediterranean, because it had come out exactly of this combination that is often dealt. Look at those backward people that lived in there, while the Byzantines, I don't know, or the Arabs were so cool. But if you really look at what Western Europe did in all this time, right, it had a very slow development, but it also created something very effective as a culture, civilization, in my opinion. But this is another thing. But just addressing it when thinking of even these traumatic events as the sack of Rome from an ideological point of view among the elites, as the idea of we must find an answer to this. Like, it's not just that, okay, it's always going, think about the Eastern Romans had pretty serious problems on their own, but at least they survived. I mean, they reinforced themselves in the certainty, in the belief that essentially their models were the ones that had been the winning ones, that they had therefore to be preserved at all costs, because that were the ones that could make them progress further. The West lived really through a crisis of some sort. It lived through the necessity of developing a very different political dialectic, which the East in this regard didn't have, if not, enclosing it in itself, right? And it was successful for some time. I'm not saying that it was necessarily negative, but it produced a society that, on the long run, missed certain opportunities, certain openings that could have made it compete actually with the same West. So as we were saying, actually the let's say the pagan intellectuals, to put it, just from a strictly literary point of view, renewed the polemic against Christianity, right? They said it's all fault because we betrayed the old gods, we do various mysteries, the Sibylline books, and all this sacred dimension that the ancient Romanity held, that Christianity had somewhat mortified, and it was seen as justified in true pagan contractualism in the fact that Rome itself, the symbol of the empire, had been stormed by the barbarians. Against whom, by the way, these elites naturally started to be ever more hostile. Like the idea of the Germans, especially these peoples of Central Northern Europe that were characterized also physically in a certain way. They were kind of beast-like, strong, the fair haired, this characters that the Romans had attributed to them. Actually, there weren't many differences among Europeans. But there was the idea of building this stereotypical picture of the barbarian as something opposed morally, right? Even before other more exterior characteristics to the virtue of the empire. And it was all fault of the Germans, right? It's all these external, these foreigners. They don't understand anything. They don't know Rome. They can't read. They can't write. They're savage, they loot, they pillage, etc. And this is the stereotype we still have both in, right? And which in part it is true. I mean, in the sense that, what do you think these people were pushed by? The Germanic ideal was to seize as much as they could, because their law was effectively, the one of the vanquishers. Like if you win, it's because the gods blessed you with then whatever you've managed to seize. If you fail, you die, so you don't have to worry about that. You just go the afterlife together with the other warriors. But it's obvious that also the Germans were, on the contrary, moved also by more positive intents. And in fact, it's great in this regard what the Germanic elites managed to achieve, right? They had to lead these very unruly tribal groups towards a direction that was completely new to them, right? The one of the monarchy, the one of the territorialization, of the Christianization, of the dialogue, right? That couldn't pass just through the sword. And naturally, from the other side, the Romans helped the Germans to achieve this. Like, they showed them what it was proper to do, what could work, what couldn't. And there was, after all, a pretty there was a major wave of political instability, as you understand, but on the long run, things were settled, right? There's this general impression, especially in the 6th century, in the end of the 5th, the idea that, after all, the Germans had brought in some provinces an order, a stability, a centrality, right? Because the local aristocracies were involved in this, to the area. Yeah, it was very, very important to say, I don't know, for the Franks to eventually, at the end of the 5th century, to take over the area, as we will see now, of Syagrius, and establishing a territorial domination there that could, dispense justice, control the area, pacify it. What we often, today, we rightfully care about our own freedom, our own rights, the idea that, we must be free at all costs. But when you live in a society where people, when there is no law, when these bands of mountaineers can come from everywhere and simply raid and destroy and kidnap, all you want is to live in peace. Then you don't care if you have to pay a toll, even heavy, that even has to do with your personal freedom. The important thing is you are alive, that your loved ones live on, that can have a future in a peaceful land, right? And this is also another aspect that is dark in itself, as you understand, but that is important also to accept the development of more stable systems, right? This is striking in the process, like that objectively there weren't many particular troubles that happened in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. There were certain religious policies that kind of polarized the internal political, let's say, struggle, but that were backed at that point both by the, both sides of the Germanic elite, together with the local aristocracy, right? It was the struggle, of the Catholic party that was kind of more pro-Roman, and the Arian one, it was pro-Germanic. But at the end of the day, these polities remained intact, and we're heading towards a system that after all was working fairly well, after all, in terms of continuity with the local administration and the functionment of the kingdom. It was naturally transforming, but not really in a conflictual way when you think in terms of Romanity and Germanic, let's say. But there was a successful union in this regard. So when Honorius died in 423, he was succeeded in the government of the Western Empire by his half-sister Galla Placidia, famously, that was the tutor of the little Valentinian III, that the title of Caesar already destined to the throne. And those of Galla Placidia were the years in which the empire, after this ever greater settlements of the Germanic populations that had occurred after the collapse of the Rhine limes, was experiencing progressively the restriction, the shrinking of the territories, directly depending on the imperial authority. In 407, for example, the last legions of Rome had left Britain, and in 425 began the retreat from Pannonia, right? Britain and Pannonia were not particularly productive areas. They were largely militarized provinces that had suffered, pretty consistent attacks from populations living at the borders, and that at this point were simply too expensive to maintain, garrisoned. Britain was actually left with a local government of Romano-Britonic, and that's where the messy thing actually happened, because we know almost nothing about what happened in Britain after the Romans left, but we have seen something pretty bad happen, in the sense that we see that, for example, the boundaries of the land plots were completely redesigned. Whichever happened, even before the Anglo-Saxon invasion, actually had redesigned completely the local resources. It was a pretty troubled moment. Pannonia was almost something a similar thing, and it had never been fully Romanized. It was had always been a militarized border, and now it was start being settled by our groups. Even in here, it was fairly close to even to the steppes. I mean, that's where actually the steppes begin in Europe, with the Pannonian Plain, and therefore the Romans simply said, okay, well, let's give it up, and actually, more or less, in the sense that especially the area of Noricum, rather, was maintained. The Alpine border was quite important, but in general, all that area was was substantially left on its own, right? And that's also where other populations would settle later on. So there were other, further movements of the peoples who had settled within the boundaries of the empire. The Suebi, the Alans, the Visigoths, and the Vandals, for example, took away from Rome southern Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula, but most importantly, the African provinces. Right, the African provinces, as we've seen before, were the granary of the Western Roman Empire. Italy had relied largely on the African grain for its supply, right? And this was of dramatic importance because it was literally like Egypt for Constantinople, right? The settlement in Africa of the Vandals was fundamentally what crippled the most the Italian capacity of re-expanding towards the Western Mediterranean. They succeeded at some point, but still, the without African grain, resources were too reduced, and at one point they were even exhausted, and that's what actually triggered the end of the western half of the empire, as we will see now. So the way these populations were settled, however, was still formally happening under the permission of Rome in some ways. There was this concession of the so-called hospitalitas, through which the Romans basically said, okay, well, you can seize officially 1/3 usually of the lands of the possessores, so the landowners, and rule on these lands on behalf of Rome. Now, this was a kind of political and juridical fiction for saying, okay, you can't settle there, but the point is, it said that it was also showing to these people how to rule in these areas, in the sense that objectively the local political and military administration was functionalized, especially for the supplying of large amounts of troops through the Annona system, for example, that already worked for essentially maintaining this bulk of what would become now the Germanic armies. And that's how basically the Germans simply took place of the Roman administration, right? And it wasn't such a traumatic event. Like, the first waves were naturally, there was a resistance, especially from the local garrisons. Think about Bonifacius, that kind of tried to stop the Vandals in Africa. So that's what brought to the major destructions, as we can think. But in general, where the Germans were to settle, they wouldn't carry out destructions. This is pretty evident. Like, what do you destroy in a place that is the one you're going to remain, right? So it was rather the resistance, right, that caused major problem. That would be pretty evident in other contexts. Like, if you take Italy, for example, well, on that occasion, simply the Byzantines sent the Ostrogoths to seize Italy and to make it work, and there was no destruction at that point. The Goths worked with the local aristocracy, right? Idem for the Longobards, that up to 60 or 70 years ago they were considered like brutal murderers of any kind. Well, actually, when they settled in Italy, they didn't touch anything because they were smart. They would maintain, like everybody, whatever they found in place, and the major destructions were only along the frontier where warfare with the Byzantines broke out. And it's always the same pattern, right? And for what concerns the Vandals especially, there is this idea that there were brutes that had they were intolerant, chiefly for religious reasons, that they persecuted the Catholic bishops and all this stuff. But actually, if you look at archaeology, for example, there are 2 burned churches on the enormous amount of that populated Roman Africa. It was one of the most radically Romanized provinces of the western half, and there is a continuity. The Vandals created this sort of maritime dominion by annexing the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, and Sicily, and launching this rise on the Italian coasts in other places. But they were faring pretty well, right? And they had even effective commanders. So the idea of the hospitalitas was, however, also that was a sort of limitation of the autonomy of the invaders. This was a kind of a naive, euphemistic way of seeing it, but objectively we must understand even here that the Germanic peoples who settled in these territories didn't think of themselves to be out of the Roman Commonwealth, right? From some time now, I'm coming up with this definition that I find fit, because the Germans didn't feel at all rightfully as Roman subjects, right? They thought they had earned that land with arms, right? And that was the deal of the empire in the first place. So it's as if they were participating to the empire in a religious way, that they were sharing with the Romans, in the sense that the Romans had their own space and they had their own. But still, they had to deal with the more powerful power that Rome represented, because at all times, doesn't matter how many tribes were settling now in the empire, well, individually, they were different. I mean, the Vandals were not as powerful as the Roman Empire. The Visigoths were not powerful as the Roman Empire, nor the Franks, nor other groups. So the empire remained the big guy that could actually, you should also check pretty much out, in the sense that they could always strike back and try to retake the lands you're seized. And it happened at some point. I mean, damn, the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, and even the Visigoths almost, they risked it pretty consistently, even at the hands of the same Western Roman emperors. They were reincorporated at some point. And once again, these systems weren't that strong at all, right? There was a consistent demographic problem as well, because theoretically the army was originally comprised of in fact, only of the Germans, while the Romanized populations dealt with the civilian administration. But if in one battle you lost like 10,000 people, either killed or captured, or deserting, well, I mean, you threw out like 1/3 or even more than your actual military resources. So you had to be pretty careful, and also the core land of these kingdoms were fairly small after all, right? They had a provincial scale on their own. They weren't more than that. But the major problem at this point arrives, in fact, for both the Romans and the Germans, at least, for everybody involved, but that were the Huns, naturally. So, as we were saying before, we made a lot of videos about the Huns, the Hunnic invasions, so we won't be repeating everything from scratch, but, the story is pretty notorious, right? This group arrived of nomadic peoples arrived from, we have literally no idea from where, right? There is no actual proof that the Huns came from any place of which we know with certainty the origin. We don't know, and we don't care, frankly, because that's not important. But surely they were something different from what the West had seen. The Eurasian peoples had definitely, even the same Indo-Europeans were acquainted with these populations. There were surely many Indo-Europeans among the Huns themselves. We're talking about shepherds of peoples, like certain scholars addressed them, so that these were bands of conquerors that subjected other peoples and brought them together with them to as a core of strength to devastate, to seize other areas, to launch raids, and to basically sustain themselves with this raiding strategy. So the big deal of all the stories that there had been a domino effect because of all these populations that had found themselves suddenly invested by this invasion. And those who were pushing most directly along the Roman borders were the Germans. But among these Germans were so many other refugees from places like, the Eurasian steppes in general, chiefly the Sarmatians. Well, these peoples that have been quite important in the places like the Ukraine for many centuries. Even a problem for the empire itself that now were literally wiped out. So there was a panic actually spreading among these peoples, and that's what effectively made the situation on the Roman frontiers degenerating in perspective. Right, that's effectively the main problem. The Huns stationed, there were first of all different groups of Huns. The Europeans dealt with the Black Huns, and for example, the Sasanian Empire with the White Huns. And the problem with the Huns is that they dwelled for some time in the steppe. Then they effectively came to settle at the very outskirts of the empire. They settled specifically in the Pannonian Plain, where also later on the Avars and the Magyars would, right? That was in fact the westernmost chunk of the steppes that arrives up to the heart of Europe. And they set their camps, this major ring also where it was fortified, where they would treasure all their loot, right, and use it to distribute it to corrupt other peoples, to pay their own mercenaries, right. And there is a very interesting split in this situation between those populations who didn't manage to escape and those who instead managed to settle within the imperial boundaries. And this is very interesting to study, especially from the Germanic point of view, because there were certain Germans that basically were that managed to escape, as we've seen, within the imperial borders. So we're talking about peoples that in fact had, in theory, at least a deeper Romanization. At least this is sure for the Goths, specifically for the Visigoths, because the Ostrogoths instead remained behind. Also, we call them like this for simplicity, but even the problems of denomination of these peoples is quite complex. But we made 2 videos about the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths to explain it specifically. Thinking about the Franks, that were kind of friends of the Romans by tradition in part, and definitely the Vandals that remained isolated, however, in Africa, but there were the Burgundians, and they were actually this kind of middle ground Germans, like the Burgundians or the Alemanni, that had problems with the Huns because they didn't know whether to. They were basically in between the empire and the Huns. The Burgundians initially were probably more pro-Huns, so that Aetius had to kick their butt at one point and deport them in this area of Sepautia, that is this region of roughly today's southeastern France and parts of Switzerland, and there from there on they become kind of more Romanized. There are peoples instead that remain under the Huns, and even for a long time. For example, the Ostrogoths that also had this relation, pretty strange relation actually with the Huns, because the same Attila actually had an enormous respect of these peoples, probably because among the various Germans were the most steppicized ones. Like the Ostrogoths were among the Germanic peoples, the one that was more massively influenced by the steppes, customs, military traditions. So there were fine horsemen, etc. They integrated massive numbers of Sarmatians, even though there is according to me, an excessive bias to say that basically they were indistinguishable from other peoples of the steppes. I don't think so, really, but I discussed this also in other videos, so it's not important now to repeat it, but these differences mattered. The Longobards, about whom we know nothing about in that specific period, but we know they were there, they were invested by the Huns, and it seemingly there is some hint that they were even the last ones to abandon the Huns at the end, under Attila's son, right? When all the other Germans were, shaking off the Hunnic yoke from their shoulders, the longer were stuck to the Huns even. And there is this very fascinating interaction. We think that the Huns communicated, extended their lordship over nominally over a pretty vast amount of land. I mean, even the Slavic areas, but even as far as Scandinavia, possibly, right? We don't have to be, dogmatic about this. This dominations could, the impact, the energy with which the Huns arrived, really had an enormous effect, an enormous deterrence of enormous chunks of Europe. But as we were saying before, in spite of their effectiveness, because there were peoples that knew definitely their business in terms of hit and run strategy and tactics as well, they looted an enormous deal. They knew how to bargain their threats and getting money in exchange. They tried first against the Eastern Roman Empire, but they saw it was a tougher nut to crack. So they had it easier in the West, where the system was much more destabilized. So there were several incursions, and yet the Romans and the Germans managed together to defeat Attila himself. The Huns had penetrated up to the north central territories of Gaul, and thanks to the alliance, in fact, of the Romans with the Federati, in fact, in 451, at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, the Roman general Flavius Aetius manages to defeat near to Troyes the Hunnic army, right? At the head of an army was formed in large part not just by Romans but by Visigoths and Burgundians. This is very interesting because some of these peoples had been defeated actually by Aetius himself, so there was definitely a mixed allegiance. But in that case, in Gaul especially, this Federati were recognizing the importance of stemming the Hunnic invasion, because that was far more detrimental for them than dealing with Rome in the first place. Was a civilized people that cared at least about having stabilizing relations. The Huns were just there to raid and incorporate as much as they could. So this is very important in the vision of what really a positive purpose should be, right? The Germans didn't want to wander around just to sack and pillage. They just wanted to settle down at one point. And there is a wisdom in it. So a civilization which the Romans themselves were recognizing at that point, so that they could cope with the Germans. With the Huns, you couldn't really cope, right? It was just a matter of brutal strength. And yet Attila gets defeated. It's very fascinating to think that, I don't know, from the side of the Romans, at least this has always struck me, the Visigoths were fighting from the side of the Huns. The Ostrogoths were fighting, and they faced each other at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. And that therefore two models in opposition, and in my opinion, the most advanced, showed, at least, even if it was symbolically, because after all Attila didn't get defeated, the Hunnic Empire remained there for a while up to the death of Attila. But there was the proof that these guys could be stopped, and this is not to say that they could have effectively taken over Europe. Once again, they didn't care. Like the Huns didn't care to actually leave like the Germans wanted. Like Attila was dramatically fascinated with Roman civilization. He wanted his baths. Also the Germans had similar attitudes, that they were attracted by civilization, but at the same time, he, as a Hunnic sovereign, he couldn't transform his people into a sedentary one without stopping being Hun substantially, right? And Flavius Attius is another very fascinating figure. He was a definitely general of Roman origin, but he had been raised among the Huns, of whom he had been an hostage. So this is also very common, that these peoples all kind of knew each other. It would be everybody's dream as an anthropologist, but also even just as a military historian, to know what this milieu actually were, like how many cultures and how many different knowledge was shared at these levels from a political and military point of view. And this paid off evidently, and Attila's invasion is a major figure. It's recalled even in the various Germanic traditional songs of the time. This was a moment in which the Germanic memory was deeply impressed, right? In which this is the time of the heroes, of which even later sagas would talk about this leaders of peoples that managed to make them settle on the fertile ground. This was the obsession of the Germans. I mean, the Germans, since the very beginning, that was their deal, right? Since they migrated from Northern Europe to Central Europe into Eastern Europe, well, the ideal was having a better land to settle, and that was the major thing. And so this was a moment of clamorous wars and fights and heroism and glorious deaths, right? And therefore, this is what impressed them, and they treasured in their first oral and eventually written memory. We may talk a bit more in depth about it at one point. After a while, Attila came back quite quickly, right? And at this time, on the northeastern border of Italy, and he entered the peninsula in Friuli by destroying Aquileia. It was a major city at the time. It was very important strategically speaking. The Hunnic army wasn't this enormous deal, right? Even in siege warfare, these nomadic populations normally sacked, renowningly sacked. You know, they stormed Aquileia seemingly just because a part of the walls fell on the Rome in the city. So, just to say also what, you know, the infrastructural maintenance at the time had reached in certain areas, and it seems that substantial part of the inhabitants fled eventually into the Venetian lagoons, where they contributed to the development of the future Venice, right? And so the Huns actually progressed into the Po Valley. They arrived up to the Mincio River, where they stopped. And it's here that took place the famous event of the meeting of Attila with Pope Leo I, that had been sent as a, you know, I can't say as an ambassador, but, you know, as a quite important authoritative figure by Valentinian III to deal with the invaders. So the tradition about the story is always that, of course, the papal authority and charisma. Leo I was a great pope, objectively, stopped Attila. And the usual counter answer is, well, it was not really so, because there were other reasons. Like, it's not that the pope actually stopped the guy. He didn't even have a, you know, the thing is also fairly more complicated. It's all part of the tradition. But the idea is that here, naturally, there were other reasons, right? For example, the Eastern Romans were now attacking the bases of Attila in the Pannonian Plain. So he had the flank exposed, the supply lines threatened. There was epidemics apparently breaking out in his army as well. So it's really a pretty bad situation to push forward an invasion of Italy at that point. But also, there are probably certain spiritual reasons for which we may think, considering the anthropology of the context, let's say, that might have actually made Attila reconsider to advance in a land that was still so important symbolically for Romanity and Christianity, right? And where that an attack to would have represented a sort of point of non-return also for what concerned the relation with the empire itself, right? So many reasons we will never know what actually happened on that occasion, but definitely we think that there was a real negotiation, right? It wasn't just about, oh, please stop, right? There were actually there were proper ambassadors that dealt with Attila and stuff. It was not about the papacy here. But Attila retreated, right? He came back, and he eventually died shortly afterwards. And so this brought to a major change once again in the international picture, because the Hunnic Empire didn't vanish immediately, like it's often said. Like these guys remained there, and the point is that we don't know much about the whoever didn't enter, like the Roman radar, right? It's normal not to know what happened beyond the Roman boundaries and precisely. But definitely the Germans and other populations that had remained under the Hunnic domination in Europe began to rebel to the invaders, and there was the battle. There were actual open clashes about which we know very few, but it's a bit of a mythical part of history, if you want. But it's evident that this brought to very different balances to be formed. For example, the Ostrogoths that disappear from the time of the Hunnic invasions reappear now. And they are a somewhat different people from what they had been before, right? These populations had been Hunnicized properly. I mean, they had received a further nomadic influence that had changed even their politics, their society. I mean, these were now peoples that had a much, probably more, not necessarily ruthless, but kind of capacity of reasoning aggressively and developing, let's say, the capacity of seeing where they could establish a territorial domination. Like the Ostrogoths were a big chunk, right? At this point, we don't know much about their composition now, what had happened to them. We saw them the last time in the Ukraine, now we see them back in the Illyricum, what had happened throughout all this time. This is very fascinating, and we try to understand it via certain details. We made videos about the Ostrogothic military, from which we understand a lot. But let's say that these were peoples who were carrying now kind of a different vision from even the other Germans that had settled in Western Empire. I mean, at this point there is a substantial difference, for example, between the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, whereas at the time of Adrianople, 378, well, these were basically neighbors, right? Yeah, there were significant differences as well, but already at that point, but at this point they had been enlarged. The same can be said for peoples like the Longobards, for example, or others would come once again to interfere with the empire. And yet, the empire keeps polarizing in this regard, these populations. After Attila's death in 453, now the empire had to deal with new peoples, if you want, that were coming just now to approach its frontiers, and that had to be Romanized, possibly in the same way that had happened with, I don't know, the Visigoths or others. So Aetius died in 454. He was killed by the emperor, and the same Valentinian III died the year after, killed in turn by the vendetta of some of Aetius' soldiers, and therefore this caused a vacuum of power that put Italy and the Western Empire in pretty serious trouble. It's not a coincidence that in 455 itself Rome suffered the second sack of this historical phase at the hands of the Vandals of Gaiseric. Gaiseric is probably, after Clovis and Theodoric, the single greatest Germanic king of this phase, historically speaking. He had a very long reign, and he resisted against the attempts of the Romans of reseizing Africa. He had enormous capacities, great cold blood, and great vision ability that greatly favored and expanded further the Vandalic strength. But eventually the same resources of the Vandalic kingdom were not infinite. So yeah, this was most a conservative policy, right? There could be an extension of Vandalic force of this, especially naval projection capability, which is not to be underestimated, because the Germans are normally credited like incapable of using the Roman navies and stuff, but they did pretty well, albeit yes, they didn't have the same imperial navy, right? But they knew how to take the sea in that regard, and this is very meaningful because Tunisia was the base, also would be the base of other powers, would do essentially the same thing. I mean, the Saracens in the 9th century, for example, would start exactly from the same location of the Vandals, right? They had maybe an extra help from the side of Spain, but the strategical range of action in the Western Mediterranean was fundamentally the same. This was a pretty troubling moment, but we don't have to think that, after all, the Roman Empire, the Western Empire was still done. But definitely the Romano-Germanic militias kept control of the Italian situation. Like, it was mostly their commanders that at that point maintained power, acclaiming and deposing continuously emperors that had become basically puppets of almost no relevance. But there were, however, certain major signs of reprisal. For example, under Majorianus, there was the invasion of Spain, and basically the Visigoths got defeated, and if the Vandals had not gotten in the way, objectively, the Western Roman Empire from Italy would have reconquered Spain. But with the failure of the expedition and the death of Majorianus, it was evident that at that point the very last resources of Italy had run out, had been exhausted. So this was perceived quite clearly, right? You have to think that there was a way to measure that at the time, right? It wasn't scientifically so, but from terms of political and strategical culture, it was evident that at one point a system was down, right? And it's objectively at this point you can say, and Majorianus is from the 60s, right? So just not even 20 years before the formal end of the western half of the empire. So you see in there that it was not over, right? If the Vandals has not gotten in the way at Cartagena against the Romans, or simply if the Eastern Roman fleet that was sent against Carthage had actually managed to destroy the Vandalic one and taken Africa, which is what easily the Byzantines would do later on in the 6th century, well, probably we would have seen a Western Roman Empire arriving quite easily at the Islamic invasions, right? That might not maybe have occurred, at least in the measure that happened. Not that, I mean indirectly. Not. I don't think that the Western half of the empire would have been able to withstand the Islamic tide if it had gone in the Near East in the same way it did. But this is exactly the point. Maybe if the Western Roman Empire had remained, the Eastern one would have been also kind of better, placed to stem maybe the same Persians or maybe things could have gone differently even there, but maybe Islam would have not risen. I say this because once again it's Gaiseric that made the difference. I mean, literally, if Gaiseric had not managed to destroy the enormous Eastern Roman fleet that was sent against him at the Battle of Cape Bon, he had set on fire the whole Byzantine fleet. Easily Africa would have remained in Western hands, because, by the way, at this point the Eastern Roman Empire would have not taken Africa too. They had literally sent a fleet to help the Westerners against the Vandals. So yeah, it would have been Africa given back to Italy, and at that point Spain would have been reincorporated, probably parts of southern France as well. So yeah, maybe the Franks would have been a problem. Maybe, we don't know, because even in there, maybe the western half of the empire would have intervened in the clashes between the Alemanni and the Franks, or with the Burgundians. We don't know, right? But history would have taken a very different path quite easily. So once again, there was no way the western half had to fall by default, right? It could really go in different ways, easily, right? We don't know, but there is no major factor that could have brought to the end of the western half of the empire if it had maintained control of just Africa. But we know how it's gone, and therefore we have to acknowledge it, and that's important. So there are these figures, for example, Ricimer and also the Odoacer, that were these other Romano-Germanic commanders that were actually very barbaric in background, right? They were really the exponents of the Germanic, the commanders of the Germanic mercenaries of Italy. That's it, and that's how Odoacer rises to power. And he especially was the one who took the initiative to say, okay, this thing of the Western Empire has become a fiction, right? We're just selecting emperor after emperor, simply saying that, there's still theoretically an imperial dignity attached to this land, but let's be honest, what is this really changing at the end of the day? So he decides to hand over the Western imperial insignia to Constantinople in exchange for the title of Rex Gentium in Italy, which means that basically he was ruling on behalf of, and now of Constantinople, because the western half had this, reverted to it, the Italian peninsula and its dependencies, which at this point included parts of, in fact, of the Danubian area, right, the Alpine area. By the way, that wasn't the only place that was actually maintained by the western half. There were still islands of Roman commanders there, including actually the very last Roman emperor. There wasn't the young Romulus Augustus, known also as Augustulus, because for stressing diminishing its, also ridiculously his power, given, however, that he was a minor, right? He was very young. He had been placed on the throne the year before by his father, the general Orestes, Flavius Orestes. So what remained at this point of the western half was just Odoacer, that wasn't western at this point anymore. The actually legitimate emperor of the west was, right, Julius Nepos, that was ruling from the Alps, of Dalmatia, right, always looking if he could go back to Italy in some ways, right, to be acclaimed emperor once again. And then the dominion of Syagris, that was this island of what would become the Frankish Neustria, so this territory north of the Loire River in the Belgian Gaul, that would be conquered by Clovis 480, if I'm not wrong, or 486 actually. 480 was Julius Nepos was killed actually by his own soldiers, right? Odoacer had also obtained the title of Patricius, which was already been of the one of Stilicho and of Aetius, right? But this is important in the name of what had been the Eastern Roman Empire, right? So this was the idea, right? I do this favor to Constantinople so that they can recognize my power in here, and that's it. But he was wrong in the sense that at least something relatively unexpected happened. Odoacer ruled for 13 years in relative tranquility, also giving to his own Germanic troops and other peoples, also including the one of origins, the Shiri, right, but also the Heruli, for example, that had backed him, and there's some privileges, right? He first of all gave them land, right? The hospitalities of the Federati, it was normal, 1/3 of the lands of the Roman landowners, and persecuting this difficult balance of the Latin and Germanic coexistence that at the time was strained still in the West, and especially in Italy, where those tensions had arisen since the beginning of the century. That, however, were working, as we have seen. Like, the coexistence was fine, and this would be even more evident later on with Theodoric, that in 489 came to Italy and besieged Ravenna and eventually killed, literally, allegedly, by his own hand, Odoacer. Theodoric, as we know, king of the Ostrogoths, was sent by Emperor Zeno in Italy to rule it on behalf of the emperor, right? And this wiped out Odoacer's rule. We could go on with this, but I think you got what the broad picture here is. I mean, it's the idea of not really of a distraction, but of a sort of superimposition or replacement, if you prefer, that definitely happened through violent stages, right? It wasn't that easy, but it wasn't such a destructive process as other episodes, chiefly the Roman civil wars, had been in the previous centuries, right? It had really weakened the whole system and had kind of lost many opportunities. So it's as if this thing died out on its own. It simply vanished. The empire vanished, and it was a very concrete way of dealing with the thing. I mean, there was no reason to think the system could go on. There was nothing, no interest to make it work again, simply because there was nobody who had the commitment at that point to try hard to restore a situation that was lost anyway, and that was seeing the rapid growth of other powers at this point. And in fact, the same Italy was overwhelmed, right? There were many, for example, when after the end of the Western Roman Empire, the Visigoths took over large areas of Gaul. Eventually the Ostrogoths came. So this was a process in which actually the situation was very far from being stabilized, because other situations had to be normalized, right? The Franks had yet to conquer the kingdom of Syagrius, and there were these other peoples on the Danubian border that pressed. Thinking about the Longobards, or the Gepids, that were still fighting against each other. But I mean, there were still matters to be settled, and this wouldn't be over, as we will see. So this would represent a serious problem at one point, because the same Byzantine intervention in Italy and in the West more generally corresponds to the fears, if you want, of Constantinople to see another major power taking over in the West, which was still possible, right? It was just Italy as the center of the Western Roman Empire that had vanished, but other peoples were actually pretty powerful. To think about the Franks, think eventually even about the Longobards that come in, quite, after the disaster had happened, right? And that therefore, actually we have discussed at length even the Justinian reconquest, and I think it was actually a fair thing to be done. I'm a pretty sound advocate of Justinian reconquest, because I believe that it was right. Right at that point, pandemics couldn't be foreseen. Like, it's wondering now if we had to stop politics in foreseeing that a major pandemic would have broken out. Well, did it happen? Right, it didn't happen at the time as well. So actually what Justinian did at the time was fine, and maybe could be handled better in certain situations, but the general principle was important, and is still derived from this possibility of reuniting, if you want, this world, right? We care about the idea of the East and the West, and we think, in fact, the Middle Ages begin with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but really no, because Roman culture survived intact for a substantial long time in countries like Italy, like Spain, like Africa, like Southern Gaul, right? And so it wasn't lost in the West, and the idea is that the Roman Empire was still there, and that these other delegates of Roman government were still part of the Roman system in a way or another. And it was true objectively, because there were literally Roman elites in these countries working at the side of the Germans. So it's quite important to acknowledge it in the first place. But we could go on for a long time, and I think we can't stop it here today. But just think about it. Just think about all the other problems. And if you look in the Migration Era playlist, you can find a lot of elements that fit into this picture that we have analyzed step by step, and we will keep analyzing. I think it's very important to look at this period, because even though it seems everything kind of slowed down, which is partly true, and up to a certain point, actually the consequences were more important exactly because of this, meaning that a move made now was much less reversible than it was when there were many more resources around. This is the beauty of this age, of late antiquity and the early modern age, and why certain striking births rather than deaths happen at this point from a cultural point of view, and that we tend to overlook in this regard. But we will address this stuff on another occasion. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.